Hello, everyone. We're going to be beginning shortly. We're just letting the room fill up a little bit.
Are you on mute?
All right, so it's 10:01 now. We're going to begin. Welcome to our Canadian International Council members and guests. We are happy to have you here today for this Foreign Policy by Canadians event. My name is Jenna Hrechka, and I'm a member of the Executive Committee of the Canadian International Council Victoria branch here on Vancouver Island. Before we do get underway, it's important to recognize that CIC Victoria members live, work, and learn on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking First Peoples, the Songhees, and Esquimalt nations, and gratefully acknowledge the Coast Salish nations on whose territories we meet today. For those not familiar with the Canadian International Council, we are an independent, nonpartisan, membership-driven think tank with the express mandate to engage Canadians on international affairs and promote a deeper understanding of Canada's role in a changing international landscape. What makes us different from many think tanks is that we have branches in 17 Canadian cities with some 1,400 members who are deeply involved with and interested in Canada's role in our world. You can find out more about us by Googling the Canadian International Council, where you can also find our CIC Victoria webpage. Today, our moderator will be Marilyn Denton, and I will introduce her shortly. And then Marilyn will take over and introduce our speaker and discussant. After the talk today, there will be an audience Q&A portion, and for this, please use the Q&A area, and we'll do our best to get to all of the questions. We're also recording this event. As mentioned, our moderator today is Marilyn Denton, a member of the Executive Committee of CIC Victoria. Marilyn retired in Victoria after 27 years working for the federal government. Her final assignment was as Trade Commissioner for Vancouver and head of the Victoria Office of Global Affairs Canada. Most of her career was spent in Ottawa, however, she has lived abroad in Pakistan and Jamaica. She has traveled extensively for her work in the Asia-Pacific region. She also worked in the private sector on various contracts and was one of the 2 founding staff for the Foundation for Educational Exchange between Canada and the United States of America, the Fulbright Scholarship Program. All right, Marilyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jenna. Just on a personal note, the one country I really wanted to return to in retirement was Japan, and I was fortunate enough to travel there twice, the last time being 2019. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, who is Jeff Chikarsky. He has extensive international experience gained through a variety of senior roles over the course of his broad and diverse public service career. He has held roles responsible for international business and trade development, policy development, strategic planning, and energy regulatory affairs. He was Assistant Deputy Minister with the Alberta Department of Energy, where he was the lead on international energy policy and negotiated formal energy cooperation agreements with the governments of China, South Korea, and Japan. He also served on a number of postings to Japan, including as Managing Director of Alberta's Trade Office in Tokyo and as Consul and Senior Trade Commissioner with the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, now Global Affairs Canada, in Nagoya, Japan. He is currently an adjunct professor at Royal Roads University, teaching courses in international business. Dr. Kucharski holds a doctorate in energy science from the Graduate School of Energy Science, Department of Socio-Environment Energy Science, Kyoto University in Japan. His academic research interests include energy security, energy trade, low carbon transitions, and the geopolitics of the international energy business. Our discussant, after you've heard from Jeff, is Joseph Caron, the former principal and founder of Joseph Caron Incorporated, a consulting business established in 2010 to provide strategic counsel to Asian businesses seeking to grow in Canada and Canadian businesses and organizations focused on development in Asia. His business experience includes 4 years with HB Global Advisors Corporation, the international consulting firm of Heaney Blakey, from 2010 to 2013. Joseph also served as strategic advisor and subsequently member of the board of directors of Westport Innovations between 2013 and 2017. He is currently a member of the board of directors of Manulife Financial Corporation. Previously, Joseph was a Foreign Service Officer for Industry Canada and the Department of Foreign Affairs for almost 4 decades, and he served in a number of key diplomatic posts, including as ambassador to the People's Republic of China 2001 till 2005, with concurrent accreditation to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and to Mongolia. He was ambassador to Japan from 2005 to 2008 and High Commissioner to the Republic of India from 2008 to 2010, with accreditation to Nepal and Bhutan. In total, he worked in Japan for 17 years, including 3 years as manager for Asia for the Council of Forest Industries of British Columbia, where he was based in Tokyo from 1982 to 1985. Joseph holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of Ottawa and honorary degrees from York University and Meiji Gakuin University in Tokyo. He has been a former Distinguished Fellow of the Asia-Pacific Foundation and an Honorary Research Associate of the University of British Columbia's Institute of Asian Research. He lives with his wife, Kumar, in West Vancouver, British Columbia. And now I turn our attention to Jeff, who will start with his presentation. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Marilyn and Chris and Jenna. And hello, everyone. And it's my great pleasure to be able to speak to you today about what I think is one of Canada's most important international relationships, the one with Japan. In particular, I'm honored to join Joseph Caron, Canada's former ambassador to Japan, whom I've known now for many years. I think we first may have met, Joseph, when you were still working with Kofi. So that was a while ago. And I look forward to him correcting all the mistakes I'm probably going to make here today. So here we go. Let's go on to today's theme, Canada-Japan trade and foreign relations. Despite the obvious, and let me just see here, despite the obvious cultural and language differences and our geographic distance from Japan, Canada and Japan share many fundamental values, including democracy, respect for the rule of law, economic fairness for our citizens, and respect for human rights. And of course, there are many dimensions to the Canada-Japan relationship, including culture, education, technology, and other things. But today I'd like to focus in on 2 dimensions of the relationship, trade and security. I will also be talking more broadly about the geopolitical aspects that help set the context for Canada-Japan relations, along with some of the trends and issues I feel are impacting on both countries and potentially on our bilateral relationship. So in this presentation, I hope to describe the current trade and security relationships. It's going to be an abbreviated one. Obviously, I can't cover everything in the time we have. And I do tend to take more of a realist approach in this presentation because I think the world is currently faced with a wide range of threats to global stability and peace. So I'll try to identify some of the issues and trends I think we currently face, and then present my perspective on what I see are some, certainly not all, of the key trade and security issues at stake in the Canada-Japan relationship. And finally, I'll present a few recommendations about what I think Canada ought to do about the opportunities and threats facing us. Okay, next slide, please. Strategic context. I'd like to start with the strategic context, and that sort of sets the stage for talking more in depth about the Canada-Japan relationship. From a geographical perspective, both countries see each other as strategically important, especially given the growing economic presence of Asia in the world economy, as well as the momentum toward regional economic integration in the Indo-Pacific. However, I'd say, in my observation over many years is that the relationship between Canada and Japan has never really bloomed to meet the significant potential it holds, even given the complementarity between the two countries. Canada's historical focus on the US and Europe, I think, combined with a somewhat European orientation among the political and bureaucratic classes in Ottawa, have contributed to the lack of a sustained strategy for engagement in Asia Pacific in general, in my view. Next slide. So I hate to begin on a downer, but there isn't a lot of good news out there at the moment, other than that vaccines are now arriving, which is very good news indeed. One second order effect of COVID-19, the pandemic, and the trade wars that we've seen is deglobalization and the repatriation of some global supply chains. Also, business and tourism are also greatly affected by the inability to travel. The global recession brought on by the economic restrictions as a result of COVID is deep. It will be long lasting, more so than the 2008 Great Recession after the financial crisis, and is likely to take at least 2 years to get back to where global GDP was in 2019, according to most economists. Trump's trade wars, especially with China, have cost consumers in the form of higher tariffs, affected retailers, impacted farmers, and even countries like Canada have been affected. We've seen steel and aluminum get tariffs by the US despite an NAFTA deal, and China's trade retaliation against Canada for the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. Climate change is likely causing more extreme weather and damage to life and property. And we've seen a lot more hurricanes, flood damage, wildfires, and so on. In response, many countries are ramping up their measures to reduce greenhouse gases, calling for net zero emissions by 2050. All of this is likely to raise costs of producing certain products, which may impact on Canada's competitiveness. So as China grows economically and its political and military power increases, it's pushing back against the West and striving for its own vision of the China dream and an expanded role and influence in the world, which is causing tension with the current superpower, the US, but also other countries in economic, military, international relations spheres. China's role in COVID-19, global health pandemic, its human rights abuses, bullying of Hong Kong democracy advocates, border skirmishes with India, and increased pressure on Taiwan weigh on an increasingly strained relationships. And within the Indo-Pacific itself, there are numerous territorial disputes and overlapping claims over islands and features, which we'll talk about in a minute. China's claimed virtually all the South China Sea for itself and is trying to assert its claims and pressure weaker countries in the region using its Navy and Coast Guard. And there are ramifications for all of this to trade and security through the sea lanes that are the vital trade routes between Canada, North America, and the Indo-Pacific, also offshore oil and gas production, and overall relations. Finally, global institutions such as the WTO, the United Nations, the WHO, NATO, G20, and others have been weakened by the actions of the Trump administration, as well as by challenges imposed by the pandemic, the global economic recession, and turbulent global politics. It's quite a mix. And if that weren't enough, go on to the next slide, please. If that weren't enough, there could well be a new Cold War brewing, if one hasn't already broken out. Under Trump, the China-US relationship deteriorated with a trade war, sanctions against Chinese companies, and competition for influence in regions around the world. Under Biden, it appears that while the anti-China rhetoric will be toned down, moves to bring like-minded democratic countries into a closer coalition to confront China's economic and military threats will increase. Will the relationship continue to move toward what some call a new Cold War? Well, that's yet to be determined, and nothing is inevitable, but it does seem clear that strategic competition between China and the US and its allies, including Canada and Japan, Europe, and others, will continue to increase as long as China continues to bully and threaten countries from Taiwan to Hong Kong, Australia, and Canada. Perhaps some kind of détente will emerge, but at the moment it seems far away. China's, at the same time, relations with Taiwan have deteriorated significantly. It's threatened to take Taiwan by force if it advocates for independence. And China and Japan's relationship, I think we need to talk about too, because it's an interesting one and can be characterized as a kind of mutual wariness, is the way I would describe it. The two countries have a territorial dispute over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, but Japan has claimed sovereignty over those islands since 1895, and the US has repeatedly affirmed that defense of those islands come under the US-Japan Security Treaty. Okay, so moving on to the next slide on Canada's response. And given all of what's been going on that I've just touched on, Canada has talked about a new approach to foreign policy. For example, on June 6, 2017, then Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland delivered a major policy speech on Canada's foreign policy priorities. She stated that Canada should do its fair share to support and participate in international security partnerships, and advocated the principled use of force together with its partners to back up Canada's diplomatic and soft power initiatives where required. She also stressed that Canada has a deep stake in and benefits greatly from maintaining the international rules-based order that governs both trade and security relationships. And she called for Canada to play an active role in preserving and strengthening this global order. More recently, of course, President-elect Joe Biden has recommitted to the US security alliances in the Indo-Pacific, and also to holding a global summit for democracy, as he calls it, that will seek new commitments from participating countries in three areas. First, fighting corruption. Second, defending against authoritarianism. And thirdly, advancing human rights in their own nations and abroad. This will be primarily, but not exclusively, focused on China. Of course, Russia would be another object for the focus too. Japan's likely to be part of this coalition, and Canada and Japan are likely to become stronger allies in my view, as perceived threats from China continue. China is developing a new, or Canada is developing a new framework for China relations as part of a new Indo-Pacific strategy that's currently under development at Global Affairs Canada. The strategy should include ways to engage with China in areas of mutual interest, while also being clear on the consequences for unacceptable behavior. Canada must reduce trade dependence on China through trade diversification, further restrict investment from state-owned enterprises in sensitive sectors, and ensure China adheres to international institutions and the rules-based order. Next slide, please. So let's focus in now, having talked about the broader context, focus in on Canada-Japan trade relations. Next slide. First, looking at our exports in total, Canada's top export destinations, you can see here in this graph. Obviously, 80% of our exports are going to the United States. But if you look at that segment of other, our largest trading partner, or export destination, I should say, right now is China, followed by the United Kingdom, Japan, and Mexico. And on the right there, you can see that table shows you the value of our exports, almost $500 million, $500 billion to the United States. And in the total trade between the two countries is around $1 trillion a year. Our exports to China, 23 billion, UK 19.8, Japan 12.6. So leaving out the United States, you can see that we do have quite a bit of trade with countries in the Indo-Pacific. Next slide. So let's look a little bit more deeply into Canada's trade with our top trading partners. And this particular graphic just shows China, Japan, and the UK. I've left the US out because it looms so large. But Canada has a large and growing trade deficit with China. It's $52 billion actually in 2019. That's a lot of money. It's our largest trade deficit with any single country. And you can see we also have a smaller trade deficit with Japan, which is so China is in the blue bars, and you've got exports on the left, imports in the middle, and on the right, you can see the trade balance, which is basically imports minus exports. And so China's in the blue, Japan's in the orange, and the UK is in silver or gray. And we actually have a positive trade balance with the UK. So that gives you some sense. Starting in March 2019, China Customs suspended the licenses of Canadian companies exporting to China for canola. That was a major loss for Canada, and the canola industry was heavily affected. 40% of canola seed exports in 2018 were to China. Now, fortunately, they found other markets, but nonetheless, exports of canola declined by $1.5 billion. China also followed up with halts to Canadian beef and pork exports in June 2019. And all of this kind of came as a shock to the Canadian government, which was taken aback by China's actions. Canada's come to realize that reliance on trade with China, or an over-reliance in trade with China, creates significant risks because the level of trade reliance can be used against us. And that became quite clear. Next slide, please. Here's our exports to Japan in 2019 in terms of the types of products that are exported. You can see that coal, that's metallurgical coal, by the way. That's not coal for power plants. That's coal used in the steel industry and the cement industry. Followed by pork, fresh pork, which is a value-added product and a huge market for Canada. Almost just over $1.5 billion of pork exports to Japan in 2019. And then you've got iron ore and copper and lumber and wheat and interesting one, hormones. Not sure exactly what that's used for. Propane, wood pulp, and soybeans and so on. So a lot of natural resources make up our exports to Japan. Next slide. Now, in terms of market access, Canada now has a preferential access to the Japanese market, along with 9 other countries, as part of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. That's an 11-member trade agreement. It was implemented in December 2018 and provides Canada with preferential access to markets in Asia Pacific and Latin America. You can see there on the map, the countries in green are the members of that agreement. Originally, the US was to be a member of the CPTP or the TPP, but it withdrew after Trump won the election in 2016. Meanwhile, Canada is benefiting from access to Japan's market and has an advantage over the US because they're not a member, particularly in several agri-food product categories. The US absence from regional trade integration in the Indo-Pacific is an advantage for Canada, who competes with the US in similar product categories in the region. Now, under Biden, the US is likely to join eventually, but will want to renegotiate some of the terms, particularly labor and environmental, IP protection and so on, but it's not expected that they'll be joining within the first year anyways of the Biden administration. So that gives Canada some time to consolidate its gains. And China has recently announced its interest in joining, but it's unlikely China would be accepted, at least for now. Next slide. So now I'd like to talk about Canada-Japan security relations. And so you can see a map here where I've done some calculations on the value of two-way trade between Canada and the Indo-Pacific. Canada has a huge stake in peace and security in the Indo-Pacific, given our current and future relations in that region. More of Canada's trade takes place across the Pacific to Asia than across the Atlantic. A lot of people aren't aware of that. In 2016, goods and services exports to the Indo-Pacific were $65 billion, and that exceeded our exports across the Atlantic, which were about $60 billion in that year. My own analysis estimates that about $27 billion of Canada's maritime trade with the region flows through the South China Sea. So that's goods moving to and from Canada, but flowing through the South China Sea, where there are some tensions, as we're going to talk about. And then there's an estimated 146 billion that flows between Canada and the East China Sea, which surrounds Japan, South Korea, and the North Pacific. So Canada has both trade and security interests at stake in the region, and that's likely only to grow in future. And I'll talk a little bit more in depth about that here. So what are the security interests that we would have, or security concerns? Well, in the South China Sea, China has laid claim to virtually the whole region through its 9-dash line. That's not recognized in international law as legitimate. And Japan and other countries view China's efforts to control that region as a potential threat, Japan included. The vast majority, for example, of energy shipments, particularly crude oil, and a large quantity of LNG destined for East Asia must pass through the South China Sea. For example, Japan received 92% of its crude oil imports and 50% of its LNG imports in 2016 through the South China Sea. And as I pointed out earlier, some of Canada's exports and imports flowing through this region as well. There could be disruptions in this region. There are tensions with Taiwan, with Hong Kong. There are overlapping territorial claims and so on in the region. All of these sort of tensions could result in the risk of miscalculation and even a conflict heightening. So there are security concerns in the region. With respect to Japan-China relations, which I think we need to be aware of, China has or Japan, I should say, has a nuanced stance on relations with China. On the one hand, it needs to get along with its giant neighbor on whom it depends for access to Japan's exports and to protect its investments in China. On the other hand, Japan considers China a strategic threat to its interests and influence in the Indo-Pacific and to its territorial integrity, particularly over the Senkaku Islands, and to its broader national security interests. As a result of a desire to protect two-way trade, we observed recently Japan joined the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which is the newest trade agreement. China is at the center of that 14-nation trade agreement, but Japan is a member of that, along with members of ASEAN nations and Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea. So it's actually a very large agreement, and it'll be interesting to see how that evolves over time. Another thing we should be aware of is, and this is related to Japan's security concerns, is the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, something that Japan came up with, an initiative to help preserve regional security in the Indo-Pacific. It's been embraced by the US, and Japan is eager to find other countries willing to join it in this effort, including Canada, and there have been discussions between the two countries about this. The intent of FOIP, as it's called, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, is to maintain the international rules-based order, freedom and openness in the region, and upholding the rule of law, freedom of navigation, pursuit of economic prosperity, and maintaining peace and stability. So fairly lofty goals, but an initiative nonetheless to try to reduce tension and keep peace in the region, but also in some aspects to offset some of the moves by China. Japan is hoping that the new Biden administration will eventually also join the CPTPP, we talked about a minute ago. That was something the US originally came up with to try to offset some of China's moves and better integrate with Asia's economies. Meanwhile, Japan's membership in both CPTPP and RCEP give it some advantages over China, which is only a member of RCEP at the moment. Next slide. Canada-Japan security cooperation. So in 2018, again in 2019, Canada and Japan affirmed their joint commitment to protect and advance the international rules-based order and cooperate closely on peace and security in the Indo-Pacific. In 2018, Canada and Japan signed an acquisition and cross-servicing agreement, which allows the two countries to make efficient use of each other's military equipment during operations and exercises, whether in Canada, Japan, or other locations. Canada is upping its naval presence in the Indo-Pacific. In October of this year, the Royal Canadian Navy sent a warship, the HMCS Winnipeg, to the Western Pacific, where it sailed through the Taiwan Strait that separates Taiwan from China. That strait lies between the conflict-ridden South China Sea and the East China Sea, for those of you not familiar. So the Winnipeg participated in exercises with the US, Australian, and Japanese navies in the East China Sea, also in Japanese territorial waters, and these have been recently often frequented by Chinese naval and Coast Guard vessels. Canada is also involved in Operation Neon. Along with Japan, they cooperate in enforcing the UN nuclear weapons sanctions on North Korea. The Canadian Navy and Air Force began regular deployments of Navy warships and aircraft to the region in 2019. Okay, so what are some of the opportunities for the Canada-Japan relationship in the future? We can skip down to slide 17, strengthening trade relations with Japan. First of all, Canada must diversify its Indo-Pacific trade and sources of investment to avoid over-reliance on China, but also to deepen its trade and security relations in the region. Developing diversified trade relations with the CPTPP countries, including Japan, is Canada's best option for reducing export trade dependence on China. This will require a well-conceived strategy aligned with a broader Indo-Pacific strategy currently under development, as I said. Japan will be a very important economic and strategic partner for Canada, especially as Canada's relationship with China continues to remain difficult. As the second largest economy in the Indo-Pacific and the third largest economy in the world, Japan should be Canada's major trading partner, source of foreign direct investment, and strategic partner in the Indo-Pacific, in my view. Canada should focus on targeting certain products, inputs, and services for trade with Japan. And some of these, I stress, include energy, which includes crude oil, LNG, and LPG, which is essentially propane. Hydrogen. Japan has a plan to become a hydrogen economy by 2050, and hydrogen is now becoming a priority in Canada as the federal government and the government of Alberta come out with hydrogen strategies. Strategic resources such as rare earths, uranium, agri-food products like canola, pork, beef, canola oil. And also we should be attracting foreign direct investment from Japan, whether it's in hydrogen, artificial intelligence, which has already begun, natural resources, clean energy technology, and so on. Next slide. Focusing a bit here on energy, of course, which I look or do research on in particular. While there's a lot of speculation that oil's in decline, investments in the oil and gas sector seem to be shunned by global investors, and climate policies are felt that they will probably shut in these resources as the world grapples with climate change. And to some extent, this may happen in some Western countries, mature economies where energy demand is declining, and where there's feasible alternatives to hydrocarbons that can help accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy. However, in the rest of the world, and especially in newly industrializing countries like China, India, Indonesia, and the Middle East, energy demand is rising fast, and demand for crude oil, natural gas, and even coal will continue for several decades at least, even as we go through a transition. These countries are going to import these resources from somewhere, so better they be from Canada, where our environmental, social, and governance performance is world-class. Meanwhile, people forget that in 2019, Canada's natural resource outputs contributed $76.6 billion to the current account, which is about 80%, and 80% of that came from crude oil and bitumen production. So, the hydrocarbon business in Canada is still very large and very significant, and it will be for several decades. Post-pandemic, Canada's oil and gas sector will be essential to a robust recovery. Energy exports will necessarily play a critical role in that recovery, and Canada must continue to build energy infrastructure that can bring Canada's energy resources to tidewater for export. Currently, we export virtually almost all of our natural gas and crude oil to the United States. Demand for energy resources in the Indo-Pacific will grow in line with economic growth in that region, even with robust climate change initiatives. Resource poor countries in the region are best supplied from friendly countries like Canada that have strict environmental and regulatory frameworks in place. So over the next several decades at least, the Indo-Pacific will be the fastest growing region in the world where demand for energy resources will be strongest. Canada should position itself to meet these needs while building strong relationships with countries that share our goals and our values. Japan, South Korea, and India are important potential energy markets for Canada. Canada can provide much needed energy security as the world moves through an energy transition that is expected to last many decades. Next slide, please. We won't go into too much detail here, but this slide really just points out the fact that there is currently the TMX pipeline being built to the West Coast. That's expected to be complete by 2025, as are 2 LNG liquefaction facilities, LNG Canada and Wood Fiber. Those should be in operation by 2025 as well. And so I've figured what the export capacity of those projects would be, and what if we were to export all of our oil and LNG, for example, to Japan. And that's not a realistic scenario. Obviously, we wouldn't be shipping all of our energy exports to a single country, but just to show you how significant they could be, if we did, we could meet Japan's potential or Japan's demand for crude oil and replace 15% of it currently, whereas Japan is currently getting most of its crude oil from Saudi Arabia. We could replace 15% of Japan's demand and lower the risk of imports from Saudi Arabia for Japan. Similarly, Canada could, if it shipped all of our LNG to Japan, take a 19.4% share of Japan's total LNG import market. Now, Japan is the largest LNG importer in the world, so that's a very significant percentage. So this is very important to a country like Japan, because energy security they have no energy. They have no domestic sources other than some hydro and a small amount of renewables currently. So Japan very much relies on safe and reliable sources for energy, and Canada could provide that to Japan. Next slide, please. In terms of the value of these exports to that region, I've calculated that as well. So the value of Canadian LNG to the Indo-Pacific, once these projects have been built and start exporting, would be in the range of $6.5 to $12.5 billion annually. That's for LNG. For crude oil, sales to the Indo-Pacific are estimated at between $12 and $21 billion annually. So in total, by 2025, Canada could be earning between $18.7 and $33.8 billion a year in additional revenue from oil and gas exports to the Indo-Pacific. And that has obviously benefits to the country in terms of jobs, GDP, closer economic ties in the Indo-Pacific, and all of which gives us enhanced diplomatic capital and influence in that region. Next slide. So what are some of the opportunities for enhancing Canada-Japan relations? Briefly, on the security front, Canada should strike a closer security cooperation partnership with Japan. It should commit more resources to both traditional and non-traditional security in the Indo-Pacific. And Canada should consider joining Japan's version of the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Initiative. On the trade and investment front, Canada should continue to take advantage of access to the Japanese market that we get from being a member of CPTPP and consolidate the gains that we've already started making there in certain product categories while the US is still outside of that agreement. And also, we should strike energy cooperation agreements, new ones, focused on energy, clean energy technologies, and strategic energy resources. And that includes things like rare earths, which are essential to clean energy technologies, to electronics, energy minerals, and also uranium. So conclusions, next slide, and the slide after. Canada should continue to take a principled approach, as Krista Freeland outlined earlier 3 years ago, to international trade and security, and focus on preserving the rules-based international order. Canada's interests can be advanced by building stronger trade and security partnerships with countries like Japan that share our basic values. Canada should reduce its reliance on trade with China and focus more on trade diversification within the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere. Reducing reliance on China will not be easy, nor am I talking about a full decoupling from China. That's not desirable or even possible, but it is in Canada's interest to diversify its trade and investment relationship. Finally, Canada should implement an Indo-Pacific strategy that will build long-term commitment and advance Canada's interests in the Indo-Pacific region, including with Japan. Finally, thank you very much for your interest and your participation today.
And we're now turning to Joseph for his response.
Well, thank you very much, Marilyn. I trust everyone can hear me. Chris and Jenna as well, for your roles in putting this together. It's a great opportunity to discuss Canada-Japan relations in the broader context of Asia, a region of the world where I spent virtually all of my career. Just to add a couple of CV points, Marilyn mentioned that I'm on the board of Manulife Financial. Manulife, to my knowledge, is still the largest Canadian investor in Japan. About 20 years ago, we bought Daihaku Seimei, a reasonably large Japanese insurance company, and absorbed it in our own firm. It plays a very important part in our Manulife's Asia strategy. On the security front, if I can blow my own horn, I initiated a major restructuring in Canada-Japan security relations in the 1990s by obtaining Japanese government support for a joint security policy review, which was conducted by Brian Jobe at UBC, who many of you will know, and Nishihara Masashi, who at the time was head of the Japanese Defense Agency. And a lot of recommendations came out of that. One of them, the Canada-Japan Symposium on Peace and Security Cooperation, in fact, still exists. So I'm rather proud of that development. As discussant, firstly, I want to congratulate and thank Jeff for an excellent overview of the parameters and the substance of the trade and security dimensions of the Canada-Japan relationship. Jeff brings a substantial direct experience to this theme. And even if he's revealed how old we are by indicating that we first met in the mid-'80s when I worked for Kofi, I forgive you for that, Jeff. I believe that he was able to bring together a great deal of knowledge and experience to the preparation of his remarks. I think that I can best contribute to this session by providing some additional insights and experience to what has been presented. First of all, with respect to the big picture, the 9 trends and influences and regional tensions listed by Jeff, as well as the threat of a new Cold War, are indisputable and overall describe many of the overweening challenges that we and the broader Indo-Pacific faces. The only potentially positive development Jeff lists, it would appear, is the election of former Vice President Joe Biden as president replacing you-know-who. But the negative prospects remain plausible and must be taken seriously. However, it's not the only meta scenario that we have to take into account in my belief. There are many other dimensions to the broader reality of the Indo-Pacific, which will shape the future. And just to list some of them. First of all, there's the immense complexity of the peoples, cultures, economic systems even, in the vastness of Asia, particularly if we go all the way from Iran to Japan and down to Australia, New Zealand, and Oceania. There are the large number of political players with their various ambitions and objectives who will shape developments as well. There are the imperatives of unhindered and continuing growth, economic growth, in each of these countries, objectives that all governments share and which give them legitimacy vis-a-vis their own publics. There are the expectations of these publics, the majority of which, particularly in East Asia and Southeast Asia, who have seen their lives being transformed through economic growth in the post-World War II era. And the discontinuance of that is unacceptable politically. There's existing and long established trade flows and foreign direct investment between and among just about all of the countries in the region. Just a few factoids. ASEAN is now China's biggest foreign market biggest market for its exports. It surpassed the EU in the last year. China is Japan's largest export market. It's no longer the United States. China is the second recipient in FDI globally, only surpassed as well by the US. When you add to these interlinkages, the establishment and confirmation of the CPTPP and RCEP, as Jeff has flagged, despite their limitations, they too are forward economic drivers. There's the inherent dynamic of corporations, companies, some companies such as Manulife, which seek to lower the cost of their inputs and obtain the highest return for their sales. That's a tremendously important engine. And then there's the disposition of Asian countries to take the long view. Any strategy that Canada needs to develop in Asia and vis-a-vis Japan as part of the predicted but not yet delivered Indo-Pacific strategy must incorporate both the negative dynamics on Jeff's list, as well as equally significant economic realities on the ground, which arguably may put a damper on the use of military force or coercion to achieve geopolitical ends. Not that accidents don't happen, or countries overplaying their hand, as China is so evidently doing at this time. But my point is that these factors, these geo-economic factors, also have to be part of the overall approach that we take in establishing our national policies vis-a-vis the region. With regard to matters of Asia-Pacific security, Jeff proposes closer cooperation with Japan on policy and delivery, the commitment of greater resources, which I understand to mean both hard and soft, in determining a role for Canada in the free and open Indo-Pacific. As Jeff flagged, the joint statement issued by Canada's Department of Defense and Ministry of Defense of Japan in 2019 reviewed an array of actual and potential fields of cooperation, such as peacekeeping. And by the way, Canada hasn't been involved in of the 36 peacekeeping, UN-sponsored peacekeeping enterprises, initiatives since World War II. Only 3 were in Asia. And the last Canadian engagement was 20 years ago in Cambodia. Now, of course, it's not a UN exercise, but there is the NEON operation, which is ongoing. This is to interdict DPRK's efforts to circumvent the various boycotts and closures of trade. But I mention these because we don't have a recent track record on actual delivery of some of these concepts. Looking at the Indo-Pacific as a whole, and given the limits on resources that Canada can deploy, where should be our Pacific security focus, and why should we put it in any one or two bags? Would partnership with Japan offer the best use of our resources? Some would argue, and I would argue, that partnering with the US in the Pacific would be more effective and probably easier to accomplish. Do we choose rather engagement on a case-by-case basis, such as, again, the NEON naval activities that we are now conducting? These are the kinds of questions, no doubt, that are being asked by Global Affairs Canada and DND and the Prime Minister's office as they develop their strategy. There's another factor that is really, really important in my experience with respect to the Canada-Japan dimension of these questions. And that is the disposition of leaders, of national leaders, specifically our respective prime ministers. Over the 7 decades of post-war diplomatic relations, there have been very dynamic periods, and there have been very inactive ones. Much depends on the chemistry between leaders. In the 50s, if I can give a little bit of history, in the 50s and early 60s, Prime Ministers Diefenbaker, Kishi, and Ikeda were able to broaden substantially the filature of relations between Canada and Japan, because Japan, less than a decade since regaining its sovereignty, again needed resources and markets, but also legitimacy in a world where it had yet to join the GATT, the IMF, or the OECD, and required support of countries such as Canada. For our part, Canada had emerged from the war as an industrial and resource powerhouse and a growing economy. We really mattered to Japanese strategic objectives. Prime Ministers Trudeau, Sato, and Tanaka were also actively engaged in trying to develop expansionary policies bilaterally. Some of you will know that Pierre Trudeau was a very big fan of Japanese cuisine, and ambassadors would take advantage of that. Japanese ambassadors have him over for sushi, and the Japanese ambassadors in the 70s had the best access of any ambassadors to the Prime Minister Trudeau. I was on his staff. Prime Minister Trudeau told me that when I was in the Privy Council office. So those kinds of things really matter. When Prime Ministers Mulroney, Chrétien, Martin, and Harper looked across the table at their Japanese counterparts, there were 20. In the period when we had 4 prime ministers, the Japanese had 20 prime ministers. It is very, very difficult to lead strategic direction unless obviously 2 countries agree, but it has to start, for the key questions, it has to start at the top. It remains to be seen whether Prime Minister Suga, who's having a bit of a rough first few months, and Prime Minister Trudeau, Justin, can develop this kind of dynamic, which in my experience is essential. Otherwise, ministers and departments become the drivers, and they are obviously sectoral. And so it's something very much to keep a very, very close eye on. With respect to trade, let me find my notes. With regard to Canada-Japan economic relationship, I might note that one view shared fully by Canadians and Japanese interested in this issue is a historical and ever-present belief that the bilateral trading and investment relationship has not fully lived up to the expectations of and aspirations of both countries. This is a theme that Jeff and I experienced all the way back to the 80s, and I first in the 1970s. Both governments and civil societies have sought ways to energize the relationship and make it more productive. Over the last 40 years, 3 separate Canada-Japan forums. These are gatherings of senior Japanese business and former politicos and their Canadian counterparts, where they spent about a year reviewing what more could be done to energize the relationship. There have been 3 of those. We established in 1970, I think it was 77, in Kyoto, the Canada-Japan Business Council, with which some of you will remember. I happen to have been. I was at the meeting in Kyoto that launched it, I remember, way back when. And that council also, for several decades, it no longer exists, worked to develop the relationship. Some of the efforts brought fruit. I think that while we have the CPTPP, initially we, Canada, Japan, were working quite seriously on a bilateral FTA, which was subsumed by the CPTPP, which I would argue is a good thing. And indeed, the Canada-Japan relationship can take some of the credit in helping push this along, certainly with Canadian audiences. As Jeff suggests, Canadian businesses must endeavor to take full advantage of the CPTPP, with Japan, of course, as a significant target, given the size and sophistication of its market. I wish I could be more optimistic about the future of energy cooperation and trade with Japan, at least between now and the medium term, whenever that is. What can also make a difference will be the emphasis that the Indo-Pacific strategy puts on trade and investment promotion, with assistance and advice provided in Canada and by Global Affairs Canada, and an expanded trade commissioner service with boots on the ground. So we'll see if that's going to happen. Thank you for the opportunity to be a discussant, and I look forward to some of the questions.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Leading off on the questions, we had one earlier. Oops, it's disappeared. All right. I'll start with the first question that is from Phil Calvert, and it is Canada and Japan signed a security partnership agreement about 10 years ago. How could this be enhanced to address interests of both countries? Jeff, do you want to start, and maybe Joseph can add something to answer that?
Well, actually, I think Joseph is best placed to answer this one, given his involvement in this very subject. So go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, sorry, I was distracted by an important message coming elsewhere. Can you repeat the question, Marilyn?
Certainly. Canada and Japan signed a security partnership agreement about 10 years ago. How could this be enhanced to address the interests of both countries?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, it would have to. A Canada-Japan security partnership is an element of something that is much broader. It has to be an element of something that's much broader, which is an overall. To put it in very, very briefly, first of all, as Jeff says in the paper, and as people like Phil and myself and just about everybody else that's probably listening, have been urging the development of not only this government, but our previous governments, to have a holistic sense of Asia. Because it's a bit like talking about Europe. People have a holistic sense of Europe, but we don't have one in Asia. And academics can talk about this, and ex-diplomats, but ultimately the Prime Minister's Office, Defense, and Foreign Affairs, and line ministries such as agriculture, for example, the main Industry Canada, the main players in shaping Canada's meta strategies, have got to provide an Asia-Canada context, which in my experience has never really really happen. We have had bilateral relations, some of them very productive, including with China, and I'd say until maybe about 10 years ago, or even more recently, I guess, under Xi Jinping. But you have to have that first, so that the Canada-Japan part has a context. And my own feeling has always been, or anyway, has long been, that unless that there is as the theme of this seminar addresses, unless there's a security context, which we take seriously, which is not only thought through, but thought through in terms of contributing to the preoccupations of our principal security partners, obviously the oceanic country, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea. Unless we develop that and we put resources behind it, it will be, we will not be taken seriously, and B, it will not be seen as a serious commitment. I personally do not know if we should be most active, let's say, in humanitarian initiatives when there are humanitarian crises in Asia. Should we be, since the traditional peacekeeping is no longer practiced as it was in the post-war era, what other forms of assistance? We have limited resources. So you need the big picture and you need concentrated resources, and they have to include a D&D component. Otherwise, we can go to as many, ASEAN partnership country meetings that we like, but we won't be taken seriously, and we won't be serving more importantly, what we deem to be our fundamental interests in Asia.
Thank you. This question comes from Cam Ross. Canada's expected benefits by 2025 may be optimistic. Considering the current China-Australia trade war, resource-rich Australia may be Canada's greatest competitor in expanding access to the Japanese market. Australia already has a robust LNG production capability. Canada is just starting its LNG production. At the same time, climate activists will try and thwart the TMP completion into Tidewater in Burnaby. How do we ramp up our efforts to increase resource trade with Japan? Jeff?
Yeah, okay, well, good question. Yeah, it may be optimistic, but I think there are good grounds for believing that they're realistic, because the TMX project is proceeding. The hurdles are being overcome. There's communication, discussion between the parties, particularly some of the First Nations groups and the project. And the potential of First Nations taking an equity position in some of these major energy projects, I think, will start to really reduce some of the tensions that are inherent in these kinds of things when they can see some of the benefits accruing to themselves. So that's positive. In terms of demand, yes, you're right that Australia is a major competitor with Canada in a number of areas, resources in particular, but countries like Japan and China and others in Indo-Pacific are looking for a diversified trade portfolio. So they don't want to be too reliant on any one supplier of energy in particular, because that makes their energy security weaker. Rather, they'd have a diversified set of suppliers. And Canada is seen as one that is very stable, reliable, and relatively close. So actually, Canada's export projects, whether it's crude oil, LNG, will be the closest to Japan in North America. And that cuts down on the cost, transportation cost, and some of the risks, because it's going through the safe sea lanes of the North Pacific. And there are several days, and it's, the travel time between Canada and Japan is much, much less than, say, certainly between the Middle East and Japan, but also between Australia and Japan. So those projects they've determined that they can be competitive on price. And I think it's in the interest of Japan and other countries to have a diversified, supply. So I don't think those are necessarily hurdles for Canada in this case. How do we ramp up our efforts to increase resource trade with Japan? Well, I think those projects are, Japan is a primary market for those projects. I think where most of the work has to continue is in educating Canadians about the value of our hydrocarbon exports and the need for those exports in the Indo-Pacific, even as we continue to work on climate change, because we're going to need all forms of energy for several decades as we ramp up our ability to produce energy in a clean way, which is going to take several decades. And in that interim, we're still going to need our traditional energy sources. So that's why I say that it's not one or the other, it's actually all of the above.
Thank you, Jeff. This is a question from Hugh Stevens. For both Canada and Japan, their relationship with the US is a key consideration. Under Trump, the US leaned heavily on Japan to agree to a sectoral trade agreement that basically gave the US the access it would have had to the TPP for agri-food products. The US is developing its own FOIP strategy that is mostly focused on containing China. Will Canada and Japan be able to develop a relationship that is not dominated by the US? Jeff?
Yeah, so good question, Hugh. And you're right that Canada, for both of our countries, the US is definitely a key and will be a key partner for both countries. And I think under a Biden administration, that's going to be much easier to manage now. Because Biden has confirmed that he wants to work much more in partnerships and return to a more traditional way of the US being a participant in multilateral efforts. Yes, the US did under Trump get a very narrow trade agreement with Japan, particularly on agriculture products, but it's quite limited. And I think that it's still, there's still a lot of work to do to, get the opportunities that would have been available to them through the CPTPP. So I still think there'll be an interest in the US in joining CPTPP, but not probably in the first year, given what the Biden administration has said so far. On FOIP, yes, I've looked at this to some extent, and you're right, the US approach to FOIP has been more of a containment strategy for China, whereas the Japanese version is much more focused on confidence building, I would say. And I think that's why it's probably better that Canada align itself with the Japanese version. But I think under Biden, he would be more amenable to that sort of view of FOIP than the one that the Trump administration in particular, with Pompeo, he was very aggressive and the rhetoric was, sort of turned up in the extreme. Whereas I think under Biden, there's going to be a little bit, that's going to be toned down. And I think my guess is they would be more amenable to the Japanese approach. I'm not sure about that. That's just a guess. So, I think that there's probably more opportunity for a real consensus on approach to FOIP now going forward with under Biden than there was up to this point under Trump. So I'm positive on that one.
Thank you. Joseph, perhaps you can answer this question from Stephen Henderson. Which groups or individuals in Canada are best positioned to assertively build relationships in Japan while balancing broader goals in the Indo-Pacific region?
Wow. Well, I'm not sure that there is a subset of Canadians who can address all of that. if both the promoting the bilateral and also in the broader context. I mean, absent real government leadership with a strategy that has elements in it, it's very much civil society that decides what they want to do, whether it's universities, the kinds of linkages they want to establish or expand upon, business community, of course. C-19, COVID-19 is putting a damper on virtually everything, but assuming that a combination of the vaccine and herd immunity get us out of this within a year or two. Civil society in all of its dimensions is going to decide in their respective narrower interests what activities they want to promote, what partnerships they want to develop with Japan and their Japanese counterparts. If we have a more clarity as to the priority that the government of Canada wants to devote in its foreign policy and the resources it spends, and for example, target Japan, if that's the right word here, or decide that it's Canada-Japan that is potentially the most productive partnership, aside from that which we have with the United States. Then, I mean, I don't think in terms of individuals, but I think more in terms of, first of all, government departments. Obviously, DND will be playing a role. The academic community, the Canadian International Council, and their counterparts, because it'll be sort of a combination of pursuing individual and sort of corporate interests, so to speak, and riding the trend that's underpinned by whatever the government strategy is. So it's pretty hard to point to, certainly for me, to point to any specific group other than the civil society groups that are promoting their interests on a day-to-day basis as we speak, despite COVID. And obviously the broadest one is the business community. Simply because of the number of players and those who have vested interest in maintaining a relationship. So I think that one really has to look to the business community in the pursuit of their interests, but that's not obviously enough, and that's what we've been talking about, something more comprehensive and strategic.
Thank you. Joseph, this is another question for you from Roman Ruby. What would be your view regarding possibly including Japan in the Five Eyes Agreement for the sharing of intelligence information?
Yes, yeah. Well, I know about that. That idea has been floated around, and I think it got some press coverage in the last few days. This is a Chatham House rules, although maybe we don't need Chatham House rules. In my experience, particularly when I was minister at the embassy in Tokyo and dealing with exchange of classified information, we had a modest program. Take my word for it, what we provided was so much more helpful and informative and insightful than what we got back, in my humble opinion. Now this is a long time ago, so I'm sure that it's much improved. But I think that first of all, it had to be an institutional agreement, both among the Japanese and then the Five Eyes, as to what would be the scope, the extent, the mechanisms. I think ultimately it's going to come down to, can the structures of intelligence gathering and sharing that we have in the Five Eyes, can the Japanese match them? Can they be as useful and productive as we consider we five consider ourselves to be? I'm totally out of date because of course I'm no longer in this, but I would certainly, if I was a politician coming with my experience, I would say, make sure that we have the institutional alignment, not only formally, but informally. And everybody involved in Japan knows that the informal links are just as important as the formal ones. Indeed, in many ways, they're much more useful. And so I would be very cognizant of the need to ensure that there's buy-in by the Japanese institutions. Otherwise, it would be one way, in my experience, which goes back so many decades.
Thank you. This is a question perhaps Jeff can answer from Don Scott. Does Canada have any manufacturing and service export capacity in low greenhouse gas products?
In low greenhouse gas products, I'm assuming you mean like sort of emissions technologies.
Yeah, emissions technology. He just ended it with GHG question mark.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any superior technology that we in Canada have, and that's just that I'm not aware of it. It may very well be the case. On the other hand, Japan does have a lot of this sort of technology, particularly vis-a-vis clean coal. They've done a lot of research on how to reduce emissions from coal plants. And there's definitely vigorous ongoing research in Japan going on into solar cells and other forms of renewable energy, as I believe there is in Canada. So there is lots of opportunity for technology, joint sort of technology and innovation cooperation. And so, and the other thing is, I think in Canada, we've done quite a bit of work on using tidal changes to generate, electricity, which would be of interest to Japan, for example. So there's some examples. The one that I think is quite exciting now is potentially hydrogen, which is sort of becoming a very topical now in Canada. The federal government is coming out with a hydrogen strategy. Alberta has announced its own hydrogen strategy recently. And Japan has had actually a hydrogen focus for many years and a vision to become a hydrogen society, as it were, by 2050, I think. So hydrogen is now becoming, and there's certainly technology in Canada, not only with Ballard, we know on the transportation side, but in the production of hydrogen now in Canada, which could be a very interesting possibility, as I mentioned in my presentation, for exports to Japan.
Thank you, Jeff. Joseph, this is a question from Phil Calvert to you, or that you could possibly answer. How should we strengthen Japan competence amongst Canadian companies and institutions to help enhance Canada's performance in Japan?
Hi, Phil. Well, we can't do that. Individual companies, do their own calculus and determine, what assets they need, what skill sets they need. If I'm answering this correctly, these are very much company by company decisions. And if the firms are dealing with, let's say, Japanese trading companies, then these companies are multilingual, sophisticated internationalists, and we are required to make, a company that is required to make less effort. I think that if companies that have a strategic interest in developing or furthering their existing links with Japan, in my experience, do hire Japanese speakers and Japanese experienced individuals. I mean, Jeff is a good example of that. And so I'm not sure that we have a solution if we think that the objective is to have more of. Certainly it would be great if more students interested in Asia at our universities, and actually this may happen now given the relationship with China. At various times in the last 20 years, in my experience, universities would say that they have more Japanese language students than they have Chinese language students. And of course, these are individual calls, and they depend on a lot on in the case of recent history, you know, how important anime is to young people, and they become fascinated and decide they're going to become, Japanologists. I don't think that there is a role other than one of suasion for government. Government can certainly in the context of promoting its trade strategies, emphasize how important it is to have the regional skill sets, whether it's Japan or Korea or China or Italy for that matter. But these are individual corporate decisions, and successful companies largely know what they're doing.
Thank you, Joseph. And I must comment that my interest in Japan was initially sparked by having a very close neighbor. The family were Japanese. And then when my children were young, I hosted a Japanese student. So I really then became even more interested and engaged with Japan, and find that it is a fascinating country. So I'll just hand over to Chris at this point, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Marilyn. It's amazing how the time flies, and we just have a few moments left. Prior to our meeting today, there was a question from Terry. I think we've answered his question, but he was talking about can Canada strengthen its security cooperation with Japan without becoming mixed up with the US and the sort of containment strategy that we see against China. And Irfani was asking about the Japanese self-defense forces and their increasing role, and whether or not they have the means to be a part of that security strategy. And if I may, I'm going to be really bold here, because it's something that my students at the Canadian Forces College have been looking at as well. And it's clear that Japan has to walk a fine line between its trade with China and also its security relationship and trade with the US as well. But in terms of the Japanese self-defense forces, yes, the Constitution has been holding them back, but we are seeing their self-defense forces become quite well equipped these days, and very proactive, and increasing their cooperation with many countries, including Canada. So I think we hear a lot about the US pulling back from the world, but they have their new Indo-Pacific Command. And as I point out to my students, on any given day, it's hard to track the numbers, but there's probably 400,000 Department of Defense employees, military and civilian, deployed throughout the Indo-Asia Pacific region. So the US presence is really quite strong, and it's very hard to decouple. But I'm just wrapping up a couple of the questions that I saw, and believe me, Jeff and Joseph and Marilyn, they're still coming in, so we can't get to all of them, unfortunately. But this has been a terrific session. I'd like to thank, of course, Jenna for opening up the session, and Marilyn for handling all the questions. It's really hard to get so many. You're trying to blend them, and you did a terrific job. So thank you for that. Jeff, for your always extensive talks and whatnot on Japan that I've seen before at Royal Roads, and it was terrific today to delve into the trade side and see exactly what is happening on the ground. And then, of course, Joseph, for bringing in your extensive background with government and post-government, and bringing that to the table. It really rounded out the entire discussion this morning. And if you haven't had enough, in 2 days' time, we're switching our focus to India. Same bat channel, same bat time. It'll be Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. We're going to take a really close look at our relations with India. So if you're not signed up for that, please consider doing so. And so on that, I think it's time for us to say not good night, but goodbye, and have a great day. And thank you, everybody, for participating today. That's it from me. Thank you, Joseph, Jeff, Marilyn, all the participants. Thank you.
Thank you.